There was a great chess tournament in 1953 in Zurich. Here's the Wikipedia page. This was a candidates tournament. The winner was Vasily Smyslov, who gained the right to play Botvinnik in the World Championship in 1954. And it was a double round robin 28 round tournament. They don't have tournaments like that anymore. Imagine a 28 round tournament today. And it was really close. Nobody really broke away. I guess Smyslov did win by 2 full points here, but 18 points out of 28 doesn't sound like a Fischer-like performance. So they had a lot of strong players, I guess. Although 18 is +8, so that's really good. Bronstein came in second. I recognize a lot of these names. I'll probably mispronounce a lot of these. Paul Carey's, Reshevsky, American player. Petrosian, ex-world champion. Smyslov was a world champion eventually too, I believe. Najdorf, we know that from the Sicilian defense. Taimanov. Averbach, good trivia about Averbach is he's the only surviving member from this tournament, the only one still alive today. He's 98 years old, and he's the oldest living grandmaster. And there's Max, I'm going to mispronounce this name, Hervé or something like that, Max Hervé, and he was a world champion too. So I think we have like 4 world champions in this tournament. So it was a candidates tournament for the right to play against Botvinnik in 1954. And we'll look at that table briefly. So here's what happened in that World Championship match. It ended up tied, 12 points to 12 points, which meant Botvinnik kept the title. But look at how many decisive games there were. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 decisive games out of 24. Compare that to the recent World Championship, Carlsen versus Caruana. 12 draws, no decisive games until the tiebreakers. Okay, so yeah, that was exciting. I better go back and look at those games. Anyway, this was a great tournament that produced a great book. I'm told by chess players that are much more knowledgeable than me that I should own a copy, so I bought this copy of the book on this tournament by David Bronstein. And Wikipedia tells me there's another book by Najdorf for the same tournament. I don't know anything about that book. But this Bronstein book is supposedly a classic. It's like a work of literature. The commentary, the annotation is supposedly very entertaining and insightful. But thumbing through the book, I did notice that it's very light on the annotation, meaning you can sometimes get 12, 14 moves in a row without comment. So you have to be a good player, I think, to get a lot out of the book. You have to understand the moves yourself sometimes. But I think that's purposeful. I don't think the author, Bronstein, wanted it to be a book full of variations. He wanted it to be like a work of literature, like I said. Anyway, I thought I would take a look at this book for the first time, crack the spine, and play through the first game. So here it is. This game was in the first round, Szabo, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, versus Geller. And let's read what Bronstein has to say about this game, see what it's going to be about. So he says, I have long suspected whenever the books I have read began discussing dark square weaknesses or an attack on the dark squares, that the subject under discussion was not only beyond my understanding, but beyond the author's as well. Certainly, I would say to myself, it must be true that the enemy dark squares will be weak if his pawns stand on light squares, and he loses his dark squared bishop. But if he then removes all of his pieces from the dark squares, what will be left for me to attack? Such was my reasoning until the day I realized that a weakness of the dark squares is also a weakness of the pieces and pawns on the light squares. The point of an attack on the dark squares is that by placing my pawns and pieces on the dark, I attack my opponent's pieces and pawns on the light. Okay, that sounds very deep. It took me a while to understand the point of that. But here's my understanding, and forgive me if this is too simplistic, and this is the point of view of a low-rated amateur. But this game is going to be about white controlling some dark squares on black's side of the board. He's going to induce black's pawns particularly a couple key pawns on the queen side, to be fixed on light squares. And when the pawns are fixed on light squares, all the dark squares around them become weak. And white is also going to trade off the dark squared bishops, so the black dark squared bishop can't protect those dark squares. And white's going to then enjoy space on those dark squares. He'll be able to infiltrate black's position by moving along those dark squares and the weakened paths along them. But black may not have any pieces on the dark squares to attack. But the point I think that Bronstein is making is, well, you can get a good outpost. You can put a piece deep into your opponent's territory on one of these weak dark squares, and from that post it can attack anything, including pieces on white light squares. So let's see what happens in this game. So c4, knight f6, g3, e6, bishop g2, d5, d4. So it looks like we've transposed into a Catalan opening. A Catalan is where you've got this queen's gambit going on, but white has fianchettoed their kingside bishop. Black plays d takes c4, very common move, which is called the open Catalan, but I don't fully understand this move. It just looks wrong to me. You can leave the pawn here and play a closed version of the Catalan. Taking on c4 just looks strange because this bishop is very powerful along this diagonal. So why are you opening up that diagonal and allowing that bishop to pressure this stuff over here on the queen side? One thing I thought of, and this might not be right, is, well, in the queen's gambit, a lot of times black wants to play c5. And when he does, if his pawn is still on d5, white can play c takes d5, e takes d5, and then black ends up with an isolated queen's pawn on d5. So if he trades off that d5 pawn first, then he won't end up with an isolated pawn. There's probably a lot more to it. But let's move on. Queen to a4 check, trying to recover the pawn. Knight b d7 is probably the way to block here. It's probably the only way to block. You can't play knight to c6 because that square is covered twice. You don't want to probably play bishop here and weaken this square for a future bishop takes b7. So you block with that knight to d7. Knight f3, no hurry to take the pawn back since it cannot be guarded. A6, but now you better take the pawn because b5 is coming to get a good pawn chain here. So queen takes c4, b5, queen to c6, pretty forcing. I suppose you could also drop back to c2, but on c6 you're attacking the rook and you're pressuring black's position and he has to respond in a very particular way. Bronstein says here, having hatched a plan to weaken the dark squares, Szabo undertakes a delicate maneuver aimed at bringing about the exchange of the dark square bishops, which will further strengthen his grip on the dark squares. And when I read that in the book, I kind of did a double take. I'm like, dark square weakness? Did that happen already? So if I were, watching this game without any annotation, I wouldn't even be thinking about dark squares. But I suppose it's all about these two pawns. On the queen side, these pawns have been lured forward to these light squares, and white can fix them on those light squares. And because they're on light squares, all these dark squares around them are weak. And I think that's the dark square weakness that's talked about throughout this game. And now white would love to trade these dark square bishops. So let's see if he can accomplish that. So the rook is under attack. It moves to b8. Bishop to f4 attacks c7. And black defends it with the nice centralizing move knight to d5, which also attacks the bishop on f4. So bishop to g5 attacks the queen. And bishop to e7 I think is forced, and this is how white trades the dark squared bishops. You can't play f6 because queen takes e6. You probably don't want to move this knight back here and trap your bishop in. This is way too passive. Maybe you can put the knight back here, but again, passive, I don't know. Bishop e7 looks like the best move, other than the fact that that's exactly what white wanted, to trade off the dark square bishops. Then castles, and now bishop b7 ejects the queen, which goes back to c2. C5, d takes c5. So it's a normal pawn break in the queen's gambit. knight takes c5, and rook to c1, gaining control of the c file. Rook to c8 to contest that. Knight to c3, maybe blocking any attack on the queen. And now Bronstein criticizes this next move, knight to f6. He says that, I'm paraphrasing here, white's going to want to play b4 at some point in the future to drive that knight away, maybe to create a nice outpost on c5, also to fix the pawns on the light squares. But if he plays his pawn to b4, then he's giving up the c4 square, which would be a great place for a black knight. So Bronstein suggests knight to b6 instead of knight to f6, because then that influences this c4 square. Also, there's a tactical reason. That knight defends the rook. And let's see, why is that important? After knight f6, white simply played b4 as planned, but Bronstein pointed out a tactic here, which may not be the best move actually. Knight takes b5, uncovering the queen and rook along this c file with tempo, taking a pawn. So black would take back, and then b4. The knight's got to move somewhere, and then you take the rook. Okay, it looks like you're sacrificing a lot of material. You just sacked a knight, now you're sacking a queen. But no, you're getting stuff back here, because now black has two options. Either play a queen here, and now the material, well, it looks like white is up a pawn. Yeah, so you don't want to do that. So the other option is you move your king away, and then you give away the rook in the corner. And now it looks like white has two rooks and a pawn for the queen. However, it doesn't look that great to me for white. It looks like I'd rather be black after queen takes b4. These rooks are separated from each other. That knight is well placed. So I don't know. So I guess Szabo agrees. He doesn't like that. So he didn't like that tactical sequence. So he just plays b4, and then knight a4, attacking the knight on the c3 square. The queen steps aside to let the rook defend, to be the primary defender, and some pieces get traded. And black castles, rook c1, and then rook d8, and Bronstein points out that you can't oppose the queen on the c file because white would just take it. Let's see if he can get away with that. Takes, 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 check. Doesn't the knight just block? Well, no, there is knight to e5 with the intent of playing bishop to c6, and you're going to win that knight. Okay, so that's good for white. So that's why we can't play rook c8, we play rook d8 instead, a3, and now let's take stock of the position. So the pawns are fixed on the queen side, and because these are on light squares, there's a dark squared weakness over here. And black doesn't have a dark squared bishop to protect. But you might say, well, doesn't white have a light squared weakness because his pawns are in dark squares? Yeah, he does, but he has a light squared bishop. So that's the difference. So how does white take advantage of the dark squared weakness? Well, let's keep going. Knight to d5 attacks the queen, queen to d4. I find that kind of funny putting it in line with the rook, but I guess there aren't any good discoveries with the knight. The queen has all these squares covered. Oops. Okay. So f6, expanding these kingside pawns a little bit. Knight to e1, it's heading for the c5 square, that important outpost for a knight. e5, queen moves to c5, and again, this is a time when Bronstein criticizes this move because it allows this queen trade, and Bronstein says he should have played queen to a7, and it says that would certainly have been much prettier, retaining his hold on the dark squares while attacking the enemy pieces and pawns on the light squares. So yeah, look, his queen is attacking these things on the light squares here, and he's retaining his hold over this dark square diagonal at least, keeping his queen alive to do some attacking instead of trading it off. And Bronstein points out you can't eject the queen immediately with this move because that rook used to be protecting the knight. And now white would just take it, and that bishop is pinned to the queen. So you can't eject the queen right away. Maybe you can play the king over here to protect your queen. so the bishop will no longer be pinned and the bishop is defending the knight, and then you're going to eject the queen. Yeah, you could do that, but then knight to d3 would come and rook to a8, queen back to c5, where originally was played in the game. But now the difference is the knight is ready to recapture and be on a great outpost. Another interesting thing Bronstein pointed out was this nice tactical sequence. If black tries rook to d7 in this position, then it's funny, white just takes the bishop. And that's because after rook takes queen, you just left control of your d5 square. Bishop takes knight check, forking. King moves, you take, well no, you play check. Queen has to intercede. You take the queen, you take the rook next. And one funny thing that Bronstein points out is in that tactical sequence, all 4 of black pieces got captured on light squares. Let's see that again. Take the bishop on a light square. Take the knight on a light square. Take the queen on a light square, and take the rook on a light square. And that goes back to his point. You have a dark square control in your opponent's position, but that means you can attack stuff on the light squares. Okay, I don't think I fully appreciate that, but I hope I'm kind of getting the point. Anyway, back to the game. I won't bore you with more variations in the queen to a7 line since it wasn't played. So queen c5 was played, allowing a trade. And Bronstein says you should take back with the rook here and keep control of those dark squares. Instead, Szabo plays b takes c5. And I think the reason that's bad is because it releases this pawn, and these pawns are now mobile again, and there's no more dark squared weakness. So you've given up on your whole plan of controlling the dark squares. You've given up on fixing these pawns on the light squares and playing that way. So you've given up your whole positional idea. But I guess Szabo was enticed to play that because it looks so good, because the knight is pinned and the pawn is threatening to move forward. But apparently black barely has a defense to this, and he plays it. He starts by blockading the pawn, then rook d1 attacks the knight and threatens the move e4 because the knight is pinned to the rook behind it. So the rook is actually forced to come up to d7 where it's under the protection of the bishop. But then bishop h3 attacks the rook, and it can't fall back because then e4 comes. So it has to move laterally, and it has to move to e7. For example, if it moved somewhere else laterally, then we have this fork. And we win a piece. White wins a piece. I like to say we when I'm on this side of the board. Anyway, that forces the rook over here. And then after that, knight to c2 came. And then a5. And so, yeah, black says, look, I've got these 2 queenside pawns over here. I can make a passed pawn anytime. I like black's position if he can hold this together. Bishop to g2. And the knight is pinned in another direction now. It's pinned to the bishop. Rook d7. Bishop to h3. Rook e7. Are they going to repeat? Well, Bronstein thinks white should repeat in this position. He says Szabo declines the repetition, although he no longer has the better position. This is a psychological error common to chess players of all ranks from beginner to grandmaster. To lose one's objectivity is almost invariably to lose the game as well. So I understand the point he's making here. You feel like you're winning the whole game, and then in just the last few moves things have changed and you're no longer winning. Well, you don't want to give it up. You want to still try to win. But you have to take stock of the position, each position, the current position you are in, and you are not winning in this position if you are white. You have to analyze it and see that black is defending, and he's not going to lose any material here, and these 2 pawns are better than that 1 pawn, and that pawn's well contained. So white should have went for the draw. Instead, he plays king to f1, and then king to f7 is a good move coming up. Do you remember that fork we were looking at before when this rook wasn't here? We had bishop to e6 forking the king and the knight. Well, black is protecting against that fork. And then king to e1. And I think Bronstein makes a mistake in his commentary here. He says this was White's last chance to force the draw with bishop h3, g2, h3, going back and forth. And I don't think that's true. So he says you can still force the draw even after king to f7. And I think this is the idea. Bishop g2 attacks the knight. It's under attack twice. It can't move because the bishop will be captured behind it. It's pinned. So this forces the rook to defend. I suppose I didn't think about this. I see it now, but I suppose maybe the king can defend. I don't know. We'd have to look at that. Maybe that's one way to break the repetition. But let's say the rook defends. Well, then the bishop comes back to attack the rook. And remember, the rook can't back up because there's e4. So the rook has to move laterally instead of on the file. But it no longer has to go over here, though. Remember when it had to go over there to protect against the fork, bishop to e6? Well, it doesn't have to protect the fork, but it has to go somewhere along this rank. Might as well go there. And then the bishop comes back and attacks the knight, and the rook goes back to defend it. It looks like a repetition, and I think that's what Bronstein had in mind. But here's the thing, though. After king f7, if White tries this repetition, I think Black has knight to c3. It's not really pinned if you're going to be attacking that rook. You don't want to play bishop takes bishop here, knight takes rook, do you? I checked this with the engine, and the engine agreed. It said, yeah, play the knight there. That's the move. So there's no repetition to be had anymore. Black is simply better in the position. So as soon as Black played king f8, no more repetition. So back to the game. I mean king f7. White played king e1, rook c7, and we're going to go through the rest of this game kind of quickly since I think Black is winning and we've already bypassed the whole middle game point of dark square control. So rook d3, bishop b7 attacking the c5 pawn, knight e3 offering a trade of knights. I guess here White cannot protect the pawn. There's no way to protect it. So he plays knight e3, Black takes the pawn and guards the knight. Knight f5 threatens a fork here. So bishop moves out of the way, calls check anyway, king to f8, bishop to g2, putting pressure on that knight, g6, expanding the king side pawns, getting the kings up. Knight comes back, attacks the rook, rook c4. f3 helps protect the knight, I guess. I don't know if that's good. The bishop doesn't look very good anymore on g2. f5 drives the knight away, rook a4. Okay, knight comes back to d1. e4, pawns get traded, rook to b3, rook to d4 check, king c1, b4, and so Bronstein says Black's plan is simple, to create a passed pawn and queen it. White can offer no real resistance to this. So knight e3 was played, followed by knight c3 attacking the e2 pawn. And I wondered here if White had to give up the e2 pawn. He just played a takes b4. And instead of recapturing, Black has this nice Zwischenzug, taking the pawn first. King can't come over, the rook has the file covered, so Black will gain the pawn back next. So Black is going to go up 2 pawns. So did White really have to drop that e2 pawn? Can he guard it somehow? I don't know. Probably not. I'm not looking at this deeply. That looks miserable to keep your bishop on f1 guarding that pawn. This probably isn't good to guard it because this is going to come. So maybe there's no hope anyway. So Black is now going to be up 2 pawns in this position after recapturing. And White plays on anyway, stubbornly. There's no hope in this position. There's no counterplay to be had over here on the king side. King gets driven away, pushes the pawn, and here's where White resigns. All right, so I hope I learned something about dark square control in this game. It was kind of complex for me. I bet if I go back and read it again years later, I'll get even more out of it. And I liked the book's style, and I'll continue to read it. Thanks for watching the video.